Well, it's a little bit after 3. We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to our community outreach meeting for the Modesto and Turlock management zones. This is our second in a series of meetings reaching out to the community participants, hopefully future participants in our planning effort for the management zones. My name's Perry Clausen. I'm with the Valley Water Collaborative. We are the organizing entity for the management zones in these 2 basins. And we've got an update today on activities that we performed in the last month since our last meeting. So the next slide, before we get started, in case there's anybody that needs Spanish translation, we're going to give you instructions from Amelia on how to access that function.
Buenas tardes a todos, bienvenida a la junta. Esta junta está siendo interpretada simultáneamente, tanto en inglés y en español. Y para poder acceder a la interpretación, si está por computadora, seleccionará el icono del mundo y luego seleccionará el lenguaje español y poner en modo silencio el audio original. Si está por su teléfono, seleccionará los 3 puntitos que significan más y seleccionará interpretación y lenguaje de español y una vez más poner en modo silencio el audio original. Muchas gracias.
Okay, on the next slide, I'm going to have Lydia give some instructions on how to provide questions and give instructions on the presentation today. So Lydia.
Thank you, Perry. Good afternoon, everybody. So just a few guidelines to review before we get into the meeting. So if you're shown on as a participant and you're identified as a phone number, we would appreciate it if you could please reach out to me via chat to let me know your actual name instead of just your phone number so that we can get an accurate representation of everyone that is attending today. In addition, because of the format of this meeting being a webinar, everyone that is an attendee is automatically muted. All communication from the Q&A side will be done using the Q&A feature. We will stop at 2 spots within the presentation for questions about halfway through and then again at the end. And we ask during those times, if you have a question, to please click on the Q&A icon and type your question in Spanish or in English, and we will be able to respond to your question in either Spanish or in English. Just please note, we are not using the raise your hand function during this webinar meeting. There will be 3 places within the presentation where we will pause and put up some polling questions, again in English and in Spanish. The first will be the English questions, and then the second poll will be those same questions in Spanish. Please respond to the polling in English or in Spanish, but not both. We do not want to capture your response twice. It'll create duplication. If you're having any technical issues, please use the chat function and one of the panelists will help to provide assistance. Thank you.
So before we go on to the next slide, I see Amanda joined us. Amanda, we have a translation function. If you'd like, we could back up and go over those instructions again. If you could unmute and respond.
Hi there. No, thank you. I do not need translation today. Thanks, though.
Okay, great. Thanks. Okay, go to the next slide then. So the meeting agenda today, very similar to last meeting, and we want to talk about the purpose of the Valley Water Collaborative and why we're here today. Then we have a review of the nitrate conditions that have been evaluated here and some of the data analysis. And then most importantly, we want to talk about the drinking water solutions that are included in the early action plan and what are those types of solutions that are going to be included in the plan, and then also ask for feedback on our plan and give you access to, or an invite, if you will, to helping us develop these plans. And then at the end, we'll go over the schedule that we have in coming months and where you can get more information. So first I want to start out by talking about the Valley Water Collaborative, the next slide, and the organization that we have formed to manage the implementation of these management zones. We're a nonprofit organization that was formed last summer, and our whole goal and mission are to provide the facilitation to develop these management zones in both the Modesto and Turlock basins and possibly other basins in our region. And we plan on working with others in this area to improve nitrate quality in groundwater into the long-term future. And then we want to work with the local communities to ensure that we're providing the information that lets them know that drinking water is available as soon as possible once our plans are completed and submitted. And as you see highlighted in our mission, we want to implement programs that provide access to safe drinking water for residences, and then in the long term, protect and enhance the quality of groundwater used as drinking water. So the next slide. So like everyone in this modern age, we have a website, and we have places for individuals to sign up to be either on the stakeholder committee or the community committees and participate in the plan development. You have the option to be on both committees if you'd like, and through signing up on our website, you will then be put on our communication list for future announcements for meetings. And then once we have draft documents that are ready for comment, we'll be publicizing that through the names that are listed on that website. In the next slide too, I want to show a little bit of an organizational chart that we have set up for Valley Water Collaborative. We have, as I mentioned, Modesto and Turlock basins and as priority 1 basins. Eventually the Merced Basin will also be included in our efforts. They're a priority 2 that starts in about a year. But very importantly, once we are in the early stages of having a draft plan next year, we are forming subcommittees for each of the 2 basins that we're focusing on right now. These will be important venues to get input to the plan, to our board of directors, help facilitate local outreach, and as we begin the water delivery activities, will help us direct our resources in the most economic way that we can. And we certainly welcome the environmental justice community, other stakeholders on that committee, or frankly, anyone in those neighborhoods, in those regions where we are going to be directing our activities. So next, I'm going to have next slide is talk about why we're here today. We want to give you an update, of course, on our management zone activities that are set up to address impacts of nitrate on local drinking water. And many of our residences, especially the rural residences, rely on domestic wells for drinking water. And we know from preliminary data, there are some high nitrate levels. And we want to make sure that we have some short-term solutions in our plans to help address those nitrates, and then have the ability to not only address the problems as they are in the immediate, but examine where there may be fixes, if you will, for the long-term restoration of these groundwater basins. And you'll be seeing our website here, as you see it below, mentioned later, and we'll be updating all of our activities through on the website through the various stages of this plan development. So next slide, I'm going to turn it over to Barbara with Ludolf and Scalmanini Consulting Engineers, and she's going to talk about nitrates in our 2 management zone areas.
Thanks, Perry. So my name is Barb Dalgish. I'm a senior hydrogeologist at LSCE. And I've been doing the technical work associated with the groundwater quality assessment and nitrate characterization for both the Modesto and Turlock management zones. All of this work is a key element to completing both the preliminary management zone proposal and early action plan documents that are the first submittals due to the regional board for the nitrate control plan. They're due by March 8th. So I'll be going over what we know about the nitrate conditions in these 2 management zone areas and how these conditions might affect you. Next slide, please. So let's jump right in and find out what we know about nitrate conditions in the Modesto and Turlock management zones. Well, in order to do that, we had to do a bunch of research. We collected as much groundwater nitrate data as we could get our hands on. So we tapped into public databases and requested nitrate data from any well records that various counties and water districts might have and were willing to share with us, and then put all of that information together into one big nitrate database. Since we're most concerned with the nitrate conditions that exist in privately owned domestic wells, and these wells are typically drilled to depths that aren't as deep as, say, municipal supply wells that cities use, or even some of the bigger agricultural wells used for irrigation, we had to categorize the nitrate data by well depth. So that way we can focus on nitrate conditions that will potentially impact people relying on private domestic wells. So we also wanted to focus our study on the most recent time period possible so that we can get the best idea of what groundwater conditions are like today. So once we had our data set of recent upper zone wells, we made a map of current nitrate conditions from the zone where your domestic well most likely draws its water. Next slide, please. So this is the map that shows what we know about nitrate conditions across both management zones. The Modesto management zone is on top and the Turlock management zone is to the south, separated by the thick black line. This map shows you the actual well data used for the analysis. So those are the colorful circles and triangles that you see on the slide. Circles are used to show you wells from our collected data set that are located within either the Modesto or Turlock management zones, and triangles are used to help us estimate what conditions are like near the borders of the management zones. You can see that there are some blank spots within the black bordered management zones. So these hatched areas didn't have any nitrate data that could give us a clue as to what the nitrate conditions are, and we're too far away from other wells where we did have data to make an educated guess. So we call these areas gap areas, where the nitrate conditions are considered to be unknown. Luckily, our map has only a small portion of these gap areas. The rest of the mapped area is filled with shaded colors from green to red. These shaded colors indicate ambient nitrate conditions in the upper zone, where most domestic wells get their water from. The greens and yellow shaded areas indicate areas with low or safe and healthy nitrate levels. The orange shaded areas indicate areas with nitrate conditions that are getting closer to being unsafe. So they haven't exceeded the safe drinking water standard, but they are considered to have elevated nitrate levels. Lastly are the red shaded areas, which indicate areas where nitrate conditions are likely unsafe for drinking because the nitrate level is too high and above the safe drinking water standard of 10 milligrams per liter as nitrogen. Those areas are mostly located on the western sides of both of the management zones, as you can see on the map. Next slide, please. So now that we know what the nitrate conditions look like across our area, we need to figure out how these conditions might affect you. The first question we have to ask is, where do you get your drinking water from? Do you have a privately owned domestic well that supplies drinking water to your house? Or do you maybe pay a water bill to a public water system like the city of Modesto or the city of Turlock, or possibly somebody else? If you pay a water bill, then you are likely already getting water through your pipes that is safe to drink. For those of us who get our drinking water from private domestic wells, those wells are likely not treated to make sure that the water we drink is safe. So our next step is to help find out if your drinking water comes from an area with elevated nitrate. We do this by identifying private domestic wells and estimating the population of residents that are in potentially elevated nitrate areas. Next slide, please. So here's a map that shows the locations of all of the domestic wells known to the state of California using their records of well completion reports. So the black dots on the map indicate domestic wells. And this map also outlines public water systems. So these areas are outlined in purple with a black hatching. You can see the city of Modesto in the north, series below it, Keys and Turlock running south along Highway 99, as well as some other public water systems in the area outlined in purple. Below the black dots and purple outlines is the same shaded coloring map that we saw earlier, showing the estimated nitrate conditions in groundwater. Again, the red and orange shaded areas indicate areas with elevated nitrate where the groundwater is potentially unsafe to drink, and the yellow and green areas indicate areas with lower nitrate levels that would be safe to drink. Next slide, please. So this slide zooms in on the Modesto management zone, or the northern half of the map we just saw. Using that map, we can identify the number of domestic wells and the population of residents that occur outside of public water systems, but are also located within orange and red shaded areas. Almost 1/3, or 32% of all domestic wells in the Modesto management zone are located outside of known public water system boundaries and may have elevated nitrate conditions. When we break this down, we see that about 190 domestic wells occur within the orange areas where nitrate levels have not exceeded the drinking water standard, but are getting close to it. We also see that there are about 350 domestic wells that are located in the red shaded areas, which indicates unsafe nitrate conditions. So a total of 540 domestic wells make up the 32% mentioned at the top of the screen that may have elevated nitrate conditions. In terms of population, using the 2010 US Census data, which is the most recent census data that we have access to, we estimate that up to 7,200 people, or about 2% of the entire Modesto management zone population, obtain drinking water from domestic wells potentially impacted by elevated nitrate. Next slide, please. So this slide shows similar information, except now we're zooming in on the Turlock management zone, or the southern half of the map we just saw earlier. For the Turlock management zone, about 2/3, or 63% of all domestic wells outside of known public water system boundaries may have elevated nitrate conditions. Breaking that number down, it translates to about 450 domestic wells located in the orange shaded areas and about 1,700 domestic wells in the red shaded areas. This makes up a total of about 2,150 domestic wells that may have elevated nitrate conditions in the Turlock management zone. When we look at the population of people, again, using the 2010 census data, of the people in these elevated nitrate areas, we estimate that up to 48,000 people, or 24% of the total population of the Turlock management zone, might be relying on drinking water from domestic wells impacted by elevated nitrate. So now we want to hear from you. We're going to have a poll in a minute that we would appreciate your participation. And also, if you have any questions about the material I just presented or any material presented up to this point, please type your question in the Q&A box and we'll go through them following the poll. Next slide, please.
So a quick reminder on the poll. The poll will the first series of questions will be presented two ways. First in English, and we'll have folks respond to it in English, and we'll share the response data of the English version, and then we will launch the same questions in Spanish and give folks a chance to respond that need to in Spanish, and then we will present the responses from the Spanish version. So first is the two questions in English. Just another few seconds to respond to the first set of polling questions in English. Okay, I'm going to end the polling for this first set of questions in English. And share the results. And all of these results will be made available later. Okay, now I'm going to launch the same set of questions in Spanish. Just a few seconds more for folks to respond to the questions in Spanish. Okay, I'm going to end the polling and share the results. Okay, and that ends this section of the presentation and the first series of polling questions. We will now move into the Q&A. Next slide, please. And as a reminder, if you do have a question, please use the Q&A icon to ask your question, and we will read your question aloud and respond. You can also ask your question in Spanish, and we will be able to communicate that question in Spanish and provide you with an answer in Spanish.
And Lydia, just to update our slide, it says chat icon, so we are using the Q&A function. Right.
It says the Q&A icon.
Oh, sorry, I'm looking at my old slide, and my apologies.
It's okay, Perry. Okay, I am not seeing any questions coming through.
Right, then if we can move on to the next slide. All right, I wanted to do a check. I have a nice gray rectangle in the middle of my screen. Is it just me?
No, I'm seeing the same thing.
Okay.
Lydia, are you still sharing the polling results?
No, I have stopped sharing the polling results.
Okay. What about now?
Oh, here goes.
Okay, the polling box is still open on my end. I thought you had control.
Okay. Thank you. All right. So for this portion of the presentation, we're going to talk further about the early action plan. In our November meeting, we introduced you to the concept of what is an early action plan and why we are in the process of developing one for the Modesto and Turlock management zones. And so we're going to kind of pick up with that and then take a little further to talk about what we're considering now as to some of the key elements that would go into those plans. We will have an early action plan for the Turlock subbasin, and we also have another plan for the Modesto subbasin. So if I could, the next slide, please.
Richard, I'm sorry. We may want to pause. There is one question that has just come up.
Sure.
If I could. It says, since the modeling won't capture the nitrate contamination in some wells, will there also be individual well tests?
Yeah, that question will be addressed later in the presentation, but yes, there will be a well testing program.
Okay. So let's first start with the fundamentals of what is the early action plan. As we've talked about previously, is the purpose of the nitrate control program is to address a number of goals with regards to nitrate management in the defined management zone area. One of those key areas is to address drinking water concerns with regards to nitrate and to ensure that residents have access to safe drinking water through the implementation of the program. The early action plan is that first step. It's literally what are the early actions that will be implemented by the management zones to address drinking water concerns with residents. the presentation that Barbara just gave was to illustrate that process that the project's going through right now to identify what are the key areas to target, how large are they, where do we need to focus our solutions under the early action. But keep in mind, in the long term, the management zone will move towards permanent solutions. So early action or temporary solutions, long term will be implemented over a multiple number of years. Next slide. So key elements that go into an early action plan is there's a component to continue to work with you, the public, not just during now while we're writing the plan, but also during the implementation to keep you informed of the opportunities for replacement water. If you are in an area that may have bad or high nitrate levels in groundwater, also provide you an opportunity to participate in the development of solutions moving forward. There's non-dischargers. There's a lot of entities out there that have interests in public health, in safe water, and the like, and they will be part of the early action plan. The part that's circled, though, is where we're going to spend most of our focus tonight. Is we're starting to formulate the ideas that will go into the early action plan, and that's the specific nuts and bolts of the plan as to when we say temporary replacement drinking water, what components are we talking about, including in the early action plan to address the needs of residents. And this will include two key parts. One is what is the actual mechanism to provide safe drinking water, but also how does well testing, how's that implemented to support the program? Next slide. So from a big picture concept, when we talk about water replacement, we need to do two things. One is to provide a solution that is what I call a common or a central solution, where we provide an opportunity for anyone to obtain safe drinking water in the simplest fashion. And that by simple, we mean there doesn't need to be a well test. They don't need to be know much about the program. They have the ability and have knowledge of locations and facilities that have been set up that they can literally drive up and fill up water bottles at no cost to them. And these will be located in appropriate places in the management zone. Typically, we would target them in the areas that were red, just shown by Barb in the previous maps in the last segment. But we also want to provide alternatives for those who can't get to a fill station for whatever reason. And so a subset of the overall program is to establish that program, and that will be defined in the early action plan. Next slide. So just briefly about water fill stations. This is a typical example of what you might see. There may be different configurations or structures. The example here is a station that's recently been opened up in Kerman, California, a little bit south and east, and it now currently is providing free water to the residents of that area. So they look like a kiosk or a vending machine. You can be assured it's safe drinking water because it is tied to a municipal water supply that has safe drinking water. And so the water that goes through that facility would be no different than what would come out of a drinking water treatment plant. Water is provided at no cost to the user. They're usually configured for different sizes of containers. It doesn't have to be 5 gallon, it can be smaller. And you can bring as many as you want. There is no restriction on the use of the facility. Next slide. But what about other options? There's some that can't get to a water fill station for whatever reason. They may not have transportation. It may be difficult to fill water bottles just because of issues, because of they can be heavy and difficult to move. So we do need to provide some other alternatives. Two that we're certainly looking at right now as common examples of the kinds of programs that might be implemented as an alternative include what we would call bottled water delivery directly to the resident so that they don't have to go anywhere, the water comes to them. Another option is what we call a point of use system. What is shown in the figure here on the right is a typical configuration of such a system where you have a particular location in your home, usually it's in the kitchen where you're cooking, that you have an additional faucet installed, and it has a treatment device underneath the sink that takes the water from your water that comes into your home from your drinking water well. It treats it, and you use that faucet for drinking water and for cooking. And these are installed in the home and then maintained over time. Again, these would be implemented by the management zone on behalf of the resident. Next slide. So we'll take a pause here and ask a few more questions to get some input. And I'll turn it back to you, Lydia, to do that.
Great. So the second set of polling questions, again, the first set is going to be in English. Just a few seconds more here. Okay. Going to end the polling for the English version of this series of questions. And share the results. Okay, and now I'm going to launch the same series of questions in Spanish. A few seconds more on the poll in Spanish. Okay, I'm going to end the polling and share the results. Okay. Going to stop sharing the results and close the polling.
And thank you, Lydia. And Christine, if you could advance the slide, please. All right, so one last little part that we wanted to bring up with regards to an early action plan is a well testing program. There are different types of well testing that can be done. This one will focus on nitrate. We are looking at about fall of 2021. We'll begin implementing the various options. Well, beginning well before then in May, but by the time we are at the point of implementing a well testing program, we're looking by fall of 2021. And the primary reason we would focus on well testing initially is to address a question when someone indicates to us that they would like to participate in an alternative program, a fill station is not available to them, or it takes too much time to go to the station, then they would ask to have an alternative, such as we talked about a moment ago, such as bottled water delivery or having a POU or point of use treatment system installed in their home. One of the things we want to be sure is to check to see that they actually have a drinking water concern. So we would evaluate that as part of a well testing program, but that would be done at no cost to the resident. So one of the questions we would ask a resident when they ask for installation, say of a POU system or receiving water, is if they have data, they can provide it, or if they need their well tested, we would send somebody out to actually get that information, and we would provide those results back to you. Next slide, please. So those are some of the key components. And while that was very brief, these will be seen in much more detail as they begin to develop in the early action plan, and there'll be opportunities to actually see it in a written form. So you have a chance to see how these concepts were developed further for the early action plan. In the meantime, how can you help with us as we work through this process? One is, if you haven't already done so, is to register with the Valley Water Collaborative website. As was shown in the beginning, there's an opportunity for anyone to go to the website and register so they receive all program notifications. You'll also then be notified about additional meetings. We will continue to have community outreach meetings as part of the development of the early action plan, and then continue as we actually implement the plan itself. We're anticipating our next meeting will be in February, and around that same time, we will be sending out for the public review a draft of this early action plan, so you'll have an opportunity to comment on that before it is submitted to the regional board in March. We also encourage you to tell other folks about this program. The more that we can have participate in the development, the more input that we can get. And then as we've already stated several times here, there'll be lots of opportunity to continue to participate once the plan begins implementation about May of 2021. And it's going to the next slide. And we have, I think, a couple more questions we wanted to ask. So Lydia.
Okay, I'm going to be launching the last series of questions here, first in English. A few seconds more here for people to respond. Okay, I'm going to be ending the polling and sharing the results. Now I'm going to launch the same set of questions in Spanish. A few seconds more here for folks to respond to the poll questions. Okay, I'm going to end the polling and share the results. And that ends our series of polling questions.
All right, thank you, Lydia. So advance the slide. I'll be turning it back over to Perry to wrap us up.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Well, I want to review real quickly what our schedule is and how you can get more information about what we're working on these days. So the next slide. So the deadline that we have in front of us is March 8th, 2021. That is our deadline to present our plan to the Regional Water Quality Control Board. It would be the preliminary management zone plan and the early action plan. As you can see on the left-hand side of the calendar, we've had this will be now our second set of community meetings. We'll have another one tomorrow evening And then in late January, early February, we're going to begin the public review process for these draft plans. So right after those are released, and again, you'll be notified if your name is on our email list that those plans are out. Well, we'll send you them on request, or we may just send them out blanket. But once that plan is released, we'll have this next community meeting to, again, get verbal comments from those interested in commenting. We're also holding in parallel stakeholder meetings. We've had 2 of those now. We will again have another stakeholder meeting at the beginning of February, again, right after the drafts are released. And then once the plans are submitted, we will continue to have both community meetings and stakeholder meetings. But for the short term, we're looking at that March 8th deadline and working to develop these plans as according to the regional water board requirements. So the next slide, these are some of the web addresses that you've seen. Okay, this is the other schedule for the Modesto-Turlock plan. So once we have the preliminary management zone plan submitted in March 2021, we begin the early action plan implementation, which is in about May. That will continue through the summer, and we expect that the well testing option will become available late fall, early winter, and then the water deliveries will begin come online in early winter, probably a year from early November, I'm guesstimating, depending on the turnaround time for review of the plan. And then as you see on the bottom, we have a pretty extensive review period for both the public and the regional water board on the preliminary plans. And then we will, once we get comments back on that preliminary plan, it will be revised and we'll submit the final management zone proposal. And then in coming years, probably late 21, early 22, we're going to be developing a long-term program for permanent drinking water solutions. So that's off in the future a bit, but it will be in line with the requirements of the regional water board. So next slide. You've seen our website address many times. Just think of Valley Water with a C. We're not going to make anybody spell collaborative. So valleywaterc.org. We have a Q&A on the nitrate in drinking water issue, if you will. We post our past meeting presentations, and then we have other information about our management zone activities. And as we mentioned, you can sign up for these updates. Feel free to email me with questions or set up a time to have a phone call anytime you feel that's appropriate. And then we will, as Richard said, we'll have our next community outreach meeting early February with an announcement going out to that email list. So next slide, I'll open it up for questions again. If anybody would like to pose a question to us, certainly welcome to go to the Q&A icon and type those in. Well, seeing no questions, I think that about wraps it up for today. Again, thank you for joining us today. We would appreciate any comments in the future on either through our email or contacting us. And we'll be more happy to elaborate on any of the points that we've discussed today. So thank you again for participating.